Americans. More than 190 million of them. A people whose story is one of movement and change. A record of migration that is unique in history. Men and women of many races and creeds, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Immigrants were entering the country at the rate of 1 million a year. Of these latecomers, many lacked the means to make their way beyond the ports of arrival. Crowded in the cities of the coast, suspended between the past and the future, bewildered, they found it difficult to accept the shifting forms they were expected to follow.
Jews and Catholics both arrived on the scene at around the same time, largely as a result of the huge amount of migration that took place over the last part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. They both arrived at the time when the Protestant ruling class had simply lost its nerve. It had lost its ability to determine culture. You can see something like an artifact like The Great Gatsby as an example of this. Tom Buchanan is talking about, those people are taken over. You got to read Stoddard's book about race and this type of stuff. And you have the Gatsby, the Jew, and the narrator, or Fitzgerald himself as the Catholic, both looking to the WASP as the kind of paradigm to emulate at a time when the WASP himself is not really sure of this anymore. A lot of what I'm saying here is taken from a book recently published, Andrew R. Heinze, Jews and the American Soul, Human Nature in the 20th Century, Princeton University Press, 2004. Heinze says in his book that psychology provided a perfect focal point for a culture clash between Jews and Catholics as they moved from the periphery toward the center of a society traditionally dominated by Protestants. For many Jews, psychology and Freud represented a path toward a more sophisticated, cosmopolitan America. For many Catholics, Freud signified a heretical departure from fundamental religious values. Now, in his book, the culmination of this conflict comes with Archbishop Sheen and Clare Boothe Luce after World War II. Archbishop Sheen was a huge presence in 1950s America. He had a television show, where he went toe-to-toe with Milton Berle and beat him in the ratings all the time. He was having a huge effect on the culture. Large numbers of Americans were converting to Catholicism at this point. It was a huge cultural battle, and by the 50s, the mid-50s, it focused on Sigmund Freud. Sheen gave a sermon at St. Patrick's at which he talked about Freud and the confessional, and basically talked about psychoanalysis as a secularized version of the confessional. It caused a huge stir. There was an article in the American Scholar which accused both Fulton Sheen and Clare Boothe Luce of being anti-Semites because they don't like Sigmund Freud. Now this is a state-of-the-art battle here that's going on here. What we're talking about here is a takeover, a redefinition, just as Fish and Derrida decades later would engage in a redefinition of discourse. The Jews at this point were engaging largely through the use of Sigmund Freud in a redefinition of the soul. Now, I mean this in a perfectly literal sense. We're talking about psyche, the Greek word for soul, and so therefore we're talking about psychology, which is the science of the soul. Now, this is classic psychology. Okay, this is Greek. And in Greek, it goes all the way back to people like Euripides and Plato. The classic definition of the soul, or the image of the soul, was the rider on a horse. The rider was reason, the horse was passion, and in many ways the bridle was the will. And so you had the tripartite soul: reason, will, passion, logos, ethos, pathos. And that was the right rule. Reason ruled passion the way the rider rode a horse. What happened over the course of the 20th century is that was inverted. In other words, we had a revolution in psychology that paralleled the later revolution in hermeneutical thought. What you had to do was, in effect, redefine the soul so that it lost all of its, Christian characteristics, even though it's only Christian in the minds of the Jews that wanted to subvert it. This is not Christian. This is not a Christian soul. It's the Greek soul. It was adopted by Aquinas and by the Catholic Church, but it's basically a Greek idea. This is what Heinze says about this period of time. G. Stanley Hall had a classic work, and it was known as Adolescence, published in 1904. According to Heinze, Hall's work was, quote, saturated in Christian reference. At this point, what happened was a war like the literary critical wars, but this became psychological, a war over who was going to determine what the soul was. The leader in this war at this particular time was an anthropologist by the name of Franz Boas, a Jew, whose assistant was going to be sort of the leading soldier, the sort of the frontal assault on Hall's book, and her name was Margaret Mead.
Franz Boas was an intellectual of Jewish extraction. He came from Germany. He became very important in the early 20th century. And the reason he was important was because he was the father of a school of anthropology that essentially said that race was not important in explaining any differences between any groups of people. His descendants have been people who have pathologized any reference to any concept of race and racial differences and so on. This is sort of a pillar of the intellectual left in the 20th century. And he's important because he founded this school. They became the heads of the departments of very important universities, so that by the mid-1920s, his students basically dominated the American Anthropological Association. They had a very clear ethnic political agenda, at least for the Jews among them. In other words, Franz Boas was not just a sort of intellectual pursuing truth or something like that. He well recognized that he had a very strong Jewish identity. That one of his main goals in life, one of his main purposes was to promote this intellectual perspective, which he thought would be important for combating anti-Semitism. He had the sort of rise of racial anti-Semitism culminating in the National Socialist movement in Germany. He viewed his ideology as combating that. He was also associated with far-left political organizations. And that's been typical, I think, of his disciples as you go down. He died in the late 1930s, but then his disciples effectively dominated anthropology down in the present.
It's classically portrayed as the nature versus nurture battle. In other words, the issue was environment or race at this point, and Boas and these people had decided that the important thing was environment, and they had to defeat the racists.
One of his big ideas was that you couldn't make generalizations about culture. You couldn't develop a theory, a universal theory of culture, because each culture was, incredibly unique, and sort of beyond the pale of scientific generalizations. And prior to him, there was a sort of robust evolutionary theory of culture where you had these various grades of culture, beginning with hunter-gatherers, chiefdoms, nation-state societies, and so on. And the problem he had with that was that the people who were doing this viewed European culture as a pinnacle. And that to him was anathema. He was a strong identified Jew. He viewed the Prussian culture of his childhood as very dangerous. He had very negative memories of that, very negative attitudes about that culture. And I think that's sort of the common denominator, I think, of all these Jewish intellectual movements that we'll talk about. is this underlying, hostility, distrust, this deep historical memory of the negative things that happened to Jews in European culture. So when he thinks of the Prussian culture of Germany, he doesn't think of cathedrals and kings and leaders. He thinks of that there were elements of anti-Semitism there, that it was a Christian culture, that Christians have oppressed Jews over the centuries. So for him, these cultures were not the pinnacle of civilization. They weren't the pinnacle of their science or anything. And so as an attempt to deconstruct culture, this is the origin of the sort of cultural relativist movement, that all cultures are sort of equal, with no way to grade them in terms of even of their technical accomplishments or anything. You had famous disciple, Margaret Mead.
She was the person who, under Boas's direction, went to Samoa, did a study of the natives in Samoa, and came back and said that basically Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, they got it from Schiller, but since psychology was German, they were using terms like this. Sturm und Drang during adolescence is only a cultural phenomenon. It's only in America. It's all the result of Christianity. If we eliminate all of these Christian sexual prohibitions, there will be no stress in society. And as proof of that, look at the people in Samoa. Well, the fact of the matter is that it became apparent after the publication of Derek Freeman's book, Margaret Mead in Samoa, an Australian anthropologist. It became apparent that Margaret Mead made it all up. It was one of the biggest instances of academic fraud in the 20th century. She didn't speak Samoan. Freeman says she was just put on by Samoan girls who would giggle and tell jokes and make fun of the round eye or whatever they call these white people in Samoa. And she overlooked a significant part of Samoan culture, which was basically digital rape, was part of Samoan culture. Didn't get mentioned at all. There were also, if the Samoan man sits under a palm tree with the guy's sister,